Spyglass Technologies is David Fries from Florida. He's going to talk to us about the autonomous underwater chemical space. Please help me welcome David Fries.
Thank the organizers actually for the opportunity here. In particular, go back here. I wanted to just mention there is a Georgia flavor to what we do actually at Spyglass. If you go over to our booth, the mass spec, the chemical sensor is actually on the table. Is actually from
He's going to use this lapel mic.
Scott Noakes actually supplied it. The graciousness of Scott, so we really thank him. Also, we're working with one of the past awardees from the program, Liquid Robotics, actually placing our technology on their platform. I'll get a little into that. And I do appreciate actually interacting with the SCAD students yesterday. It's an opportunity for them to provide some content, maybe in the future actually for Spyglass. So that's actually some value added. One of the things you have to bear with me on is that I'll have to drink as I go along. There's a normal nervousness you go along with giving presentations, plus then you got the flooded lights. But I'm a stage 4 head, neck, throat cancer survivor, so I can't generate my own saliva. So I actually have to drink from time to time. After 5 minutes normal talking, you have to drink probably 2 minutes after talking here. But I'm cancer-free in life, and I really thank you for being here. So one little talk, now I'll get into my normal routine. I'm Mediterranean, so I like working with my hands. So that's one of the reasons why I want to mic myself on up. So the talk is really about our technology we had developed in the chemical space surveyor. And there's a couple technologies actually that are fused here, along with mobile vehicles. So I'll get into it. The autonomous underwater chemical surveyor is what this technology is, and it has 3 applications. One is in the environmental, one is in the energy, and then also one is in the education sector, and I'll go over that. So I start with one of my heroes, Buckminster Fuller, and the most important fact about Spaceship Earth, there is no instruction manual. We all know that. So how do you write such a book when what you see is limited? We're all filtered and biased by our sensory apparatus. And so if you look in the visible, you see one thing. If you look in the infrared, you see another. The certainty presentation yesterday was wonderful, how they were able to shift in this infrared reflectivity and then actually still retain color so you can actually get the aesthetic. So imagine if you could see into the X-ray. You can see into the insides of things and the unseen. Or if you could see microscopically or chemically. Both chemical sensors and biological sensors, looking at the microbial content, really are important in terms of being able to drive the ocean dynamics and the ocean processes. How do you write such a book if you can't see? What would you see? What I'd like to try to have you take home from this innovation is that we're really measuring the unseen, and the unseen then helps create and shape our world. In other words, to the left is a methane molecule, and of course then the Deepwater Horizon event essentially impacted everyone. It affected everyone from Savannah to St. Petersburg to Wichita, Kansas. CO2 molecules, it affects everyone. Climatic change, ocean acidification. So it's actually the unseen component that primarily is what's driving some of the scene of what we're politically, culturally interacting with. How are you going to make maps without having the right technology? So how do you make pollution maps? Oil discovery, this has application not only in education, not only in environment, but also in the energy business. So for oil discovery, oil baselining, how do you create your climate change ocean chemistry handbook? How do you look at non-point source field pollution? What about creating satellite imagery underwater, similar to what's overhead? How do you listen in to the conversations that are happening between microorganisms and underwater organisms? In other words, the language they're speaking, and are they speaking correctly, and what's interfering with their speaking now as we add more into the ocean? This is the primary invention and innovation. It's the in situ mass spectrometer. I'm the inventor of it. And what mass spec does, and I won't get into gory details, it allows you to sensitive simultaneous detection of multiple chemical species. So it's like an electronic nose. This is typically what you see in a mass spec. Very hairy picket fence information that ends up being overwhelming, and only specialists can interpret sometimes. But what you see is multiple species at the same time, and that's the power of it. You can start to look at the whole chemical profile. So I'll just go through a little video. What we're trying to do is shift it from that complex information into just simple presentation of the chemical information in an underwater environment. This just represents basically some underwater imagery of two different masses. This is real data that was measured by the mass spec. When you start to look at it, you start to geo-reference the data and start to actually have a feeling that you're seeing parts of the unseen in the underwater environment. This is an interface that we had developed actually as a way to visualize and help with the visualization. Love to be able to have the SCAD students take a whack at this and further advance this. But you can start tagging information to it too, and I'll get to that in a second. So what can you do with mass spec? I won't go into the detail, but you can establish background levels, which are really important. How do you know change is bad if you don't establish the background level? You can detect elevated concentrations of chemicals, whether we're putting them in, Mother Nature inputs them, there's different causes. You can inspect hotspots, oil well leaks, hotspots for oil discovery, and determine the ecosystem health. Again, trying to listen in to what's being conversed underwater, I think is really important, and you can't do that right now. This is one version. We have two. Our first version is a quadrupole. Our second is an ion trap. I won't get into the details. They're kind of technically two different, but with different capabilities. But nonetheless, we do have scalability in what we can offer. In the second generation version, the ion trap is a little larger, has some additional functions. But it's 70 watts, not much different than a light bulb, so it's really amenable to be able to go on underwater vehicles and act as that electronic nose. This is the interface, and the principle behind it is actually relatively simple. We use a membrane, a polymer membrane, and we allow, depending upon those characteristics of polymer membrane, chemistry to flow through that membrane onto the vacuum side. So you have water, membrane, and then vacuum, and then we make measurements on the other side, that vacuum side, and look at the chemical composition. Really robust, so it pumps till the cows come home, and this has been down to 2,000 meters. We've run them on different platforms, remotely operated vehicles, underwater vehicles of different types. I'll show you one of our underwater vehicles. In addition now, we're looking at liquid robotics and working with liquid robotics on their platform. Examples of the data. To the left, you see actually profiling data from the Macondo well in the Gulf of Mexico during cast while the oil was being dispersed. To the right is some work on Western Lake Erie, looking at beta-cyclocitral. So we can basically adapt to the different molecules, but in this case, we're using that molecule actually to detect the presence of organisms. So we can actually, by a proxy, start to look at microorganisms just by their chemical signature. Do methane distributions. This is work. I want to cite that both Tim Short and Scott, but Tim Short in particular, has provided a lot of the data. Tim's worked with the technology and evolved it and deployed it. So this is some work that Tim did with some collaborators out in Santa Barbara looking at methane distributions, which then really play into looking at oil and energy discovery, being able to map on out seeps, natural seeps, and indicators of subsurface oil. Now I want to do a conceptual shift, I think actually, yeah. The mass spec has its limitations. It can look at this chemical space, but not all of it. So what we did is we wanted to be able to get the entire chemical space. And one way we can do that is start to think about moving away from the mass spec, which does real time, into being able to do near real time. And what I mean by that is we wanted to basically take the automated capability of underwater vehicles and extend the radius of that automation to basically have an automated material processing on board. So you almost have an automated boat captain with an automated deckhand. And so what we developed was Essentially, I replicated all the steps that a chemical technician does in a laboratory and put it into a can. So this is a humanoid sampling robot. And it's really a living system. So it's electronics, it's got fluids coursing through it, it's got optical components, pumps. It actually swings into place. 2 different mechanical motions are present on there. So essentially, we call it a technician in a can, but we also call it a graduate student in a can. But what that does is now allows us to capture at the event, so you don't miss the event. So if you're 100 miles offshore, you can actually capture the event, and along with your real-time sensor, be able to combine the best of both worlds. When you capture that event, the automated vehicle will come back almost like a golden retriever. You lift off your sample, run the full battery of tests on it, and now you can look at the entire chemical space. This is our version of an underwater vehicle. It's based on solar panels. It's a renewable energy platform. So similar to the liquid robotics platform, it has extended range, and so it can go on in particular for for as long as there's sunny days. And then we combine it, of course, with the sampler, and it allows us to have that sampling capability. So being able to do spatial mapping, spatial sampling, real-time and near real-time. So then that allows us, and this is actually data from excursions, to be able to open up that chemical space. Now we're looking at very complex organic molecules back in the lab, or we're looking at microparticles and microbiology back in the lab. And then allows us to look at the elemental table and the molecular space and isotopes, and essentially any analytical technique you can do can start to be applied towards your sample that you preserved and captured. So we've moved into visualizations too. So not only stopping at the hardware, we moved into basically being able to present the data, and we have a portal that allows us to take our data but then append on different sensor data from other manufacturers. So giving you a whole situation kind of picture awareness. So what does this all mean? I liken it as to we developed a new ocean camera. So similar to what visual cameras have done to allow you to create TV and broadcast and cinema, we've done that with this chemical sensor, which is this automated sampler along with the mass spec with a mobile platform, and then the visualization to be able to report that and distribute that information. That's actually a web-based visualization. So it allows us to be able to then send that information anywhere. So I liking it, the way the take-home message is really look at this as almost a camera analog, an underwater camera, to be able to see the unseen. We look at this as almost trying to emulate what evolution's doing, right? So evolution, we all know one of its best examples of a shark. It's got its nose and it's got its mobility. By working with liquid robotics, we're taking our camera system and evolving what becomes an electronic fish. But we're moving beyond nature, so we can sense hundreds and thousands of chemicals, which the shark can't. And then we're extending this further by taking this unseen information and start to actually melt it with learning information. This is an example for CO2, calcification, carbon cycling. So it's basically starting to append information onto the underwater environment and tying it actually into the molecules or the unseen. And so the idea is that that unseen, which drives a lot of what we experience, politically, culturally, educationally, can now be illustrated and combined. Just another version of this. This is really where ultimately we think we're making a contribution to the instruction books. I go back to my original Buckminster Fuller quote. The ability to be able to see real time and predict and create models based on the chemical drivers and the biological drivers that are driving the ocean dynamics. This is the first time you're starting to peer in at that level, spatially, temporally, to see what actually is happening in the instruction manual. So we feel that we actually have the right technology to be able to provide that insight. And that has actually, of course, energy implications, education implications, as I mentioned. One thing that also that we look at from a company, is ocean technology historically has imported technology into its space, or oceanography. So satellites, computers have been migrated on in and created better oceanography. We see this as a reverse direction, where the technology developed in the ocean technology starts to migrate back on land. So Spyglass has opportunities in source water and reservoirs, freshwater, rivers, industrial water quality, and also in oil and gas produced water. There's a meeting going on right now for my company and some people up in the Marcellus Shale area. We're using the mass spec to be able to do hydraulic fracturing monitoring, so allowing the general public to be able to have a better sense of the water quality used in those applications. So we're moving beyond just the ocean, but it's a great example of the ocean technology and advancements migrating back on land. Principles, I'm David Fries. I'm the developer originally of the technology. My partner is Chris Melanson. He's out in San Francisco. I could go into, deeper into my experience and Chris's experience, but I think I'm probably close to out of time, so I can take questions, but that's the end of my presentation.
Good job. I'll let you have your water. Did great. So as always, we have time for a few questions, if there are any. Please, ma'am, either way.
What's the maximum time you've had one of these instruments in ocean water, and have you had any fouling problems?
Yeah, it's a good question. We've probably had it depends on what the platform is. Our underwater vehicle, we had it in the water for 6 weeks, and it depends, of course, what latitude you're at. And in Florida and down our way, things grow pretty quickly. So it depends on what the application is of the anti-foulant you actually put on the vehicle. On the mass spec, because we pump through traditionally, and the polymer we use is actually a polydimethylsiloxane, it's a PDMS, it's a medical polymer. It's actually highly resistant to biofilm growth over a normal time period. We're seeing that a lot of information can be gotten from a 3 to 4 week period of deployment. And so in the course of that, whether you're doing it as a stationary platform or a mobile platform, you see less of the growth actually on the instrument, see more growth actually on the vehicle.
Question, please.
Hi, thank you. This is a type of technology that probably most of us don't have a good feel for what's out there in the world now. And since the Ocean Exchange is looking for innovative ideas, could you please tell us, other than your technology, what are people using right now to get along, since your thing is not available? And the second question, if you were to win, what would you do with the $100,000? Thank you.
That's a good question. I think if you look at where we're at on our technology, we're basically shifting as a thematic area, moving what occurs in the laboratory out in the field and underwater. So it's basically a paradigm shift. And so we have a lead position in that. What I did not talk about, we have a whole series of, as part of the company, we have a series of automated samplers for the microbial or genetic analysis. It's a separate technology suite. But what that allows us to do is be able to actually start to think about being able to do automated measurements. And so we have a strong IP position in that space. In other words, if you start to put any of these instruments, which historically have been in the laboratory, below the water line, I think you need to, there's an interaction we can have. So hopefully that answers the one question. I think we're out there at the apex, and we actually have kind of a lead position. And then as for the utilization, 100,000, I think our technology, because we've had a substantial amount of investment in terms of grants or whatnot to get it to maturity, I would focus most of our finances on both the additional marketing, sales, and distribution channel development, and in particular, the educational component. That underwater learning cloud concept is a very powerful thing because it starts to migrate the oceans actually inland. And so we have a roadmap using, again, our ability to collect unique data and to pin information on it to be able to turn the underwater experience. So you're actually looking at this geospatial data and interacting with it and almost moving it up the value chain so it becomes an educational experience. So you can actually do true interactive learning and hopefully almost do gamification of the underwater environment. So basically, you can't do that completely if you don't have all the data. And so we work with modelers, we could work with different presenters and visualization of the data. And I think that we have a good ability to be able to take our data and then be able to visualize it and grow in a value chain. We'd prefer to use that money to be able to really explode in that area. So I almost liken it to Google Street View underwater and then being able to bring the information really to the physical environment. Hopefully that answers it.
Time for one more, please, sir.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the total available market for these sensors, who your customers are going to be, and what kind of profits they're going to support?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like your normal evolution, I think, of most technology, advanced technology innovation, you tend to see early adopters being the research and development community, educational institutes, and research and development spaces. We really actually are seeing a lot of pull actually from the oil and gas sector. So being able to baseline or be able to automated mapping, if you would, of the spaghetti network of pipelines that are in, for instance, the Gulf of Mexico, or being able to respond to an oil spill, or even then be persistent to be able to measure afterwards, after cleanup. That whole life cycle is really a strength of ours. So if you look at that, there's the R&D market, and then it's really the oil and gas. And but if we look at the oil and gas sector, that's just offshore. And as I was saying earlier, we're migrating actually into unconventional space onshore, both in the gas industry, but then also moving further into water quality. I had a figure in there, the overall market size, again, because the ability to be able to do real-time chemistry in an industrial loop does not exist right now. And so our ability to be able to start to march from offshore, near shore, inshore, and actually in industrial processes allows us to have hopefully the market size that even if we're inefficient, we're able to potentially grow a sizable company. I think I had numbers there as the overall market size is 8 billion, but you know how you can trust those numbers hopefully that answers it.
Quickly, one more question. Short answer.
Kind of a technical question, but aside from housing your electronics, what depth can you operate at for your biological or your chemical sensors?
Yeah, so we had the one chemical sensor, it's been down to 2,000 meters. That one is basically using a high pressure membrane interface. We've actually developed a separate pressure reduction module that allows us to actually have variable depth. So it's a separate technology we developed that allows us to relax basically the pressure. And so either one of those sensors operate in a normal environment at ambient pressure, but we have an interface there. It's relatively compact and allows it to step down. So right now we have the 2,000 meters. We've had some interest out of the North Sea area to take it further. I look at that as primarily a pressure vessel construction problem, not an interface problem.
And I'd just like to point out that if, obviously he knows what he's talking about, but his coffee cup says, "I love science." Yeah. So I think that gets you extra brownie points when you're on the Ocean Exchange. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Good job.